you were here yesterday, this is one of the first times that we've given 2 webinars in 1 week. We did one yesterday, which I'm sure you got the invite to because the 2 of them came in the same email. Yesterday's webinar was including continuing education units for attorneys. And we had about 30, I think 35 people there. And it was more of a deep dive into the specific regulations and legislative things that are going on in the state of New Jersey and for attorneys. Today, I'm going to go over to my, I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully you can see today's presentation there. You should be able to see it. Does everybody see it there?
Yes.
You should. If you don't, let me know. And I also, unfortunately, I'm going to have to, my camera's on this monitor. I'm going to have to look over there because usually it shows it on both screens, but it's not doing it today. Can you guys all see that presentation, the first page?
Yes.
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 All right, great. So what I'm going to be talking about today is reserve study, structural inspection, and banking inspection requirements that are happening right now. It's real-time stuff. Now I want to share with you, if it will let me switch slides, let me see. All right, I put up who am I because I've been involved in some very interesting stuff over the last year and a half, although I've been involved in interesting stuff before that also. But somehow I've gotten involved in some very interesting thing that's going on in our industry, having to do with structural inspections, reserve studies, and all kinds of things. Now, all of this started, as you're all aware of, because of what happened in Surfside, Florida, with the Champlain Towers building collapse. So the whole industry has changed because of that. And of course, there were 98 people that were killed. It's an absolute tragedy. But out of tragedies, hopefully good things come out of them. And one of what I'm going to be talking about are some of the things that have come out of this that are going to change the industry. So hopefully this kind of thing can never happen again. Now, for those of you who know me, you know that I've been very involved in CAI for many years. I was president of New Jersey chapter, Pennsylvania chapter, national president, all that kind of stuff. So as part of that, and one of the few engineers who not only do reserve studies, but get involved in doing design specifications and things like that for existing buildings. So thanks to that kind of background and my involvement with CAI National, I've had the opportunity to be involved in a number of different interesting things that can continue to today. For example, when the collapse first occurred in Florida, CAI immediately created a task force, and the task force was ultimately prepared a publication, which you can all get, it doesn't cost anything. It's called the Condominium Safety Public Policy Report. Now, that report is pretty extensive. It's probably about 40, 50, 60 pages long. And there were, I think, 6 people from around the country that co-chaired this. And I was one of the co-chairs in the development of this public policy report. There were, I think, 2 managers, 3 attorneys, 1 other engineer who primarily does, or no, as chairs, there weren't co-chairs. There wasn't another engineer. So I was the only engineer giving a technical perspective to this. And I had the opportunity to be involved as we pulled this whole thing together and issued it. There were also, we reached out to probably over 600 people across the country to get feedback. We reached out to other organizations like the American Society of Civil Engineers, you name it. We did research all around the world to see what people are doing around the world. So got some firsthand upfront experience in terms of this. I will also tell you that as I go through the presentation, you'll see that this public policy report is going to be updated relatively soon. And the reason I say that is because what's happening is an evolution. And I'll show you what's going on as I go through my presentation. But right now I serve on the New Jersey Legislative Action Committee as well as the National Legislative Action Committee. And just yesterday we had a national LAC meeting, and there were probably about 100 and something people from around the country who joined, because yesterday all the legislative active committee people from across the country were involved, as well as the National Legislative Action Committee, which is made up of about 30 people, which I'm on. And one of the things that was agreed yesterday was that we need to create a new task force to update this public policy. And I'll tell you why, but I'm going to be on that task force. Also, as a result of that, CAI is in the process, and we're about 99% done with updating the reserve study standards. And the reason those are being updated is because the public policy clearly ties together reserves, maintenance, and structure in the public policy report. So it was agreed, and pretty quickly, that we need to update the reserve study standards to reflect a number of different things. That national standards, by the way, when you see the heading, it's being changed from National Reserve Study Standards to International Reserve Study Standards. That's why I keep on slipping with the word. But so I'm going to go through as part of my presentation, what are some of the changes that are going to happen with these standards and how they're going to affect you. And that standards is just about done. We have a meeting in a week or so of our national group, which I'm also co-chair of, with Peter Miller from Delaware, Robert Norland from California, and Bob Browning from California. And we're co-chairing this group. And it's 99% done. We're just voting on it next week to issue it publicly. The only last thing we may do with it is to send it to all the RSs across the country for comment, but it's 99.9% done. So you're going to get a sneak peek today at what are the changes and how they affect you. The other thing that CAI has done, which you can see how I spend my life, is they developed a national task force, which we're coming out with the best practices paper on maintenance. And you'll see the connection between reserves and structural and maintenance as part of my presentation today. But that best practices paper is chaired by somebody from California. I'm also on this task force. There's about 4 or 5 people. And that should be issued, as a matter of fact, at National Conference in Dallas in May. This best practices paper on maintenance is going to be introduced, and a few of us are giving a seminar at the conference explaining what it is and how it works and all the connections and stuff. So I've been very involved in that. Also, there are other states. Today's presentation is primarily focused on what's going on in New Jersey. We are working in other states, but based on the audience today, it's primarily based on New Jersey. But I was asked in Delaware. Delaware has a task force in Newcastle County, Delaware, to come out with some legislation in regards to structure and reserves and things like that, exactly what we're talking about. And I'm the co-chair of that task force in Delaware, which actually have a meeting this afternoon to talk about what we're doing. But most of the stuff I'm talking about and what's going on in other states like Maryland and Florida and all over the country is based on this public policy paper that CAI put together. So while I'm going to be talking about it based on the public policy paper and New Jersey, keep in mind that this is going on all across the country. And if anybody has questions about specific states or anything, please feel free to ask or email me on the side, because we're involved in a number of those also. So there's a number of things going on. Also, CAI, I'm looking at the list, offers a class called the M320 class. The M320 class has to do with managing and maintaining high-rise buildings. That's taking place the end of this month, and anybody wants to go. It's a webinar. It's a 2-day webinar, and I'm one of the facilitators putting that together also. But a lot of it has to deal with what I'm going to be talking about. So that's who I am. So the interesting stuff I'm involved in right now, and what I'm going to be talking about is all this stuff. So this page just says all this stuff essentially. So again, the starting of this was Surfside. You've all seen this picture, so I'm not going to show it to you. But it's a progressive thing. I hate to say that it's not based on buildings being built wrong. It's being based on buildings getting older. So don't think that when you see problems that it's because the building was built wrong. Now, for those of you who live in New Jersey, you're probably familiar with what just happened last week, I think it was, in the last 2 weeks, that in Sea Isle City, there is a condo on the ocean. This is what it looks like, where one of the balconies, you can clearly see in the picture that this balcony collapsed on this building. There was a workman that was killed when it fell on him. But you can see that the balcony collapsed. This building is right on the ocean. So it reinforces again what happens to building as they get old if you don't do some of the things I'm talking about and legislative requirements that are going on to make it happen. One of the things I have to point out as I go through this, because as you know, I go off on tangents on this stuff, is that a lot of people think that the problems that we have with our buildings are only buildings that are close to the ocean or close to some water. There's no question that water is something that makes buildings deteriorate faster as they get older. There's no question that salt water can even accelerate that process even faster. but there's no question that it doesn't only happen to buildings along the ocean. As a matter of fact, if anybody'd like to see it, I can share an article that was in a paper in Florida, where the Florida requirements that came out of as a result of the collapse of the building in Florida says that the inspection period timeframe for buildings that are closer to the ocean, I think it's 3 miles to the ocean, has to be more frequent than buildings that are not close to the ocean. I think if it's close to the ocean, it's within 3 miles, it's a certain number of years. If it's past that, it's more years. But there's some pushback going on right now in Florida because there are articles and there's scientific evidence that shows that the closeness to water does not relate to how frequently you should inspect a building, because they all deteriorate based on water, and rain happens everywhere, even though an ocean may be next to a building. So I just want to clear up the fact that this is not a geographic problem. It's all buildings, irrespective of where they are. And for example, I'll touch on parking lots, but parking lots have huge problems because the water that comes into a parking lot, irrespective of being close to the ocean, this time of year, the tires carry water and salt from the roads, which increase the rate of deterioration. But again, deterioration will occur anyway. So it's not related. Now, the reason I bring that up now is because obviously Sea Isle, this condo in Sea Isle is right on the ocean. And it may have accelerated the rate of deterioration, but it's not the cause of it. The other thing I'll mention is that there hasn't been a report that's coming out saying why this happened. I look at the pictures and I have some kind of feelings of what happened here, but I'm not here to say at all, what happened here, what caused it, but the balcony did collapse. So a little more background. What is a building structure? A building structure is essentially what holds it up. Now you can see my pointer here, and let me just make sure we are recording, right? I'm pretty sure we're recording this. Because
Yes, you're good, Mitch.
Oh, thanks, Chelsea. That's Chelsea, by the way, from Kipcon. But what is a building structure? Because that's the key to everything we're doing. The building structure is what holds up the building. That's essentially what it is. So if you look at a building on the left, it's a high rise. On the right, could be a townhouse, but it's made up of columns, which are these vertical guys that hold up the floors and the roof and all kinds of things. And then there are the beams that go across the building that hold up the floors. And then there's the foundation. So building structure is primarily made up of the columns and the beams. Now, the reason I'm saying that is because balconies, such as you see here, are not generally considered to be part of the building structure because they only primarily support their own weight. They don't support the weight of the building. So if a balcony falls, like when we saw in the picture, the building isn't going to collapse. But if a column or a beam in this building fails, then the building could fall down. So there's a discrete difference and a pretty important difference between them that I'm going to touch on as I go through the presentation also. But this is what the building structure looked like. And let's go to, let's see why aren't if I go. All right, there we go. So here is what is the building's primary load-bearing system. Now, the reason I use the term primary load-bearing system is because when you get into the regulations, both in CAI's public policy as well as legislation in New Jersey and other states, they use the terminology for inspecting a building that you're inspecting the primary load-bearing system. The primary load-bearing system, again, is the parts of the building that if something happened to them, the building could collapse. Now, the definition, and this is taken directly from the legislation that's pending in the state of New Jersey, as well as other states, is that the primary load-bearing system is the assemblage of structural components with the building that, by being connected to each other, form a path by which the external and internal forces, such as wind, snow, the weight of the building, apply to the building or delivered to the foundation. So in this diagram, you see that there's the weight of the building coming down vertically, the weight of the people inside of it, the live load, the snow on the roof, and it comes down through this system, this bearing system, in a vertical direction into the foundation. But then from the side, you have wind loads and earthquake loads and things like that, which go in from the side and are brought down to the foundation. But that's the definition of primary load-bearing system. Now, the reason why some of these slides are relatively new because things are changing, like I said. Now let's talk about what is the building facade. And the building facade is the exterior walls of the building. So for example, in this building, the exterior facade are these walls that are on the outside of the building. The purpose of the facade, of course, is to look good and make the building look good. but it's also to prevent air and water from entering the interior spaces. So these facades. Now, the facades, when you look at definitions of facades in a number of different places, it says the facade is made up of the exterior walls as well as the appurtenances. That's a common word that's used. The appurtenance are the things that are attached to the facade, such as the balcony. Now, it's critical that you understand that, because if you look at the legislation in most places, it talks about the primary load-bearing system being inspected on a periodic basis, but it doesn't talk about inspecting the facade, which is something that's critical if the balcony is part of the facade, because the balcony can collapse. Now, the original thoughts in this was that the facade, well, let's put it this way, in about 13 or 14 cities across the country, there are facade inspection requirements where the building owners are required to inspect the facades of their buildings. It's generally on a 3 to 5 year basis to make sure that nothing on the building will fall and hit somebody that's walking by. But there's no place in the country until recently that had specific ordinances that said you had to inspect your building structure to make sure it didn't fall on the people inside of you. The only place that had any kind of requirements like that were the 2 counties in Florida, and in one of them is where the Surfside building was. So clearly the inspection frequency and things were not good enough to keep something like this from happening. But right now there's about 13 cities in the state, in the country that have facade ordinances. But I'm going to show you in the state of New Jersey, there are 2 localities, Jersey City and Cliffside Park, that recently have come out with specific ordinances that you have to inspect the facades. Now, they were a little ahead of the curve here in a good way, because, for example, the CAI National Public Policy is going to be revised, and one of the things that's on the agenda definitely is the inclusion of facades and balconies and things like that into the public policy. So it's interesting, but that's why I've added this slide in here about what a facade is. Now, like I said, CAI has come out with this legislative initiative. It's this publication. If you want a copy of it, feel free to reach out to me, or you can go to CAI's national website and get a copy and download it. But this public policy deals with reserve studies and funding and maintenance and structural integrity. Now, maintenance and structural integrity, I'll get into along with the reserves, but you notice that it says reserve studies and funding. The reason it says that is because there's so many places across the country, well, not so many, but there are places across the country that some places require reserve studies, other places require funding, and there aren't, but when they require funding, they may not have to require a reserve study be done to see how much you fund. And when they require a reserve study, they may not require you to fund the reserves, but have to have a reserve study done. So it's very important to recognize that everything I'm going to talk about, for example, legislatively in New Jersey and every other place, as that's where this is happening, as well as the public policy, talks about reserve studies and funding the reserves, not just doing one. This has resulted in, I mentioned before, the National Task Force that's revising the reserve study standards to reflect structure maintenance. Now, don't tell anybody you saw this page, because this is a draft of what the cover is going to look like when it's issued, but you can see it says International Reserve Study Standards, and this is a draft, but this is what it's going to look like. In New Jersey, the legislative initiative it includes periodic inspections, reserve studies, funding, and maintenance. This is the Senate Bill number 2760. The person who's really is pushing this bill is Senator Singleton. I've had the opportunity to meet with him a number of times. Absolute gentleman. He knows exactly what he's doing here. And this legislation, which I'm going to, as I go through my presentation, when I talk about specific things, I'm going to try and show you the actual wording from the legislation so you can see what's coming if this thing, and hopefully when this thing is approved, because it's in the process right now of going through the legislative process, which I'm learning a lot about, and it's very interesting, as you can all imagine from looking at the news every day. But if you look at it, it says, the importance of structural integrity of residential buildings in New Jersey has become a growing concern for many, especially in the wake of the tragic collapse of a high-rise multifamily housing structure in Florida. In light of these growing concerns, it is appropriate for the legislator to put in place appropriate procedures for inspecting, evaluating, and maintaining the structural integrity of certain residential housing structures within this state. So this is what it's based on. That's where it comes from. And if anybody would like a copy of this, just let me know. I'd be happy to share a copy of the draft. You can get it to the public documents already, but there are some things based on conversations with different parties in the industry that are being modified to reflect questions and comments and concerns people have. So it is a work in progress. There's some local ordinances in the state of New Jersey that are already in place. As far as structure and facades, both Jersey City and Cliffside Park have ordinances in place that require you to do inspections. Now, for example, in Jersey City, the structure has to be inspected every 10 years. And this is what it says. And I'm not going to critique it unless you call me on the side, and I'd be happy to, but it says, in order to maintain a building's structural integrity, the following requirements shall apply to all existing buildings or buildings constructed hereafter, which are concrete buildings more than 6 stories in height. Now, you'll see as I go through my presentation whether or not I agree with how it's defined, but they require this type of structural inspection by a licensed architect or engineer. It's interesting because they're talking about the structure. It's interesting but good. But if you look at the definition, it says it's not limited to inspection of foundation, balconies, all structural members, and waterproofing. So they've included some things in here in their definition of a structural inspection that are not, they're not, first of all, based on a primary load-bearing system. They include the balconies, which is good, but it also talks about waterproofing, which is, I think, a very important key, because waterproofing is what causes deterioration of structure if the water gets in. So if the exterior of the building is kept functional and water doesn't get in, it'll reduce the likelihood of structural deterioration. The thing that's interesting here is, as I said before, if you look at the definition of structure versus facade, you would think that this waterproofing would be in this facade inspections, not the structural inspections. But this is Jersey City. Now, here's what Jersey City says about facades, that they have to be inspected every 5 years. Now, for a facade, they said the facade should be constructed every 5 years. This must include inspection of the exterior wall and the appurtenances. This inspection will be in addition to any other building inspections. Now, so they are requiring facades every 5 years and structures every 10 years, but they're including some of the things that you would think are included in the facade within the structure. So there's some different things going on here. The other thing to keep in mind is they say that the facade inspections are for all buildings which are more than 6 stories in height or consist of a masonry facade or brick and are 4 stories or more in height. So they're going to a little more specific detail of what's required to be inspected. And by the way, if anybody would like to copy this presentation, you're more than welcome to have it. Or if you want the full statutes or ordinances I'm talking about, we have them. We'd be happy to send them to you. So this is Jersey City. Now let's go on to Cliffside Park. Cliffside Park says that the structure has to be inspected every 10 years. But now if you read it, it says a builder instruct the following requirements to all existing buildings or buildings constructed of steel, stick, I don't know what a stick is, brick, stucco. Stucco is generally a facade, not a structure, or prefabricated panel facades, that's part of the structure, and or concrete buildings more than 4 stories in height, or buildings consisting in excess of 12 residential units. So they're saying that if you have a residential building, irrespective of the height, that has 12 residential units and it's made up of these materials, it needs to be inspected. But you see here that between Jersey City and Cliffside Park, there's differences in definitions of what's going to be inspected and how often. Now you look at Cliffside Park for facades, it says every 5 years. It says requirements shall apply to all existing buildings or buildings constructed which are more than 3 stories in height for the facade, and or 2, consist of masonry, structural steel, stucco or planking, and or brick in excess of 20 feet. So they're saying that for the facade, you have to look at if it's more than 3 stories high or more than 20 feet height. So you may have a 2-story building that's only 20 feet high, and it appears that it should be included. But the point I'm showing you, the reason I'm showing you this stuff is, and it's not just New Jersey, these are some New Jersey examples, but for example, in Manhattan, they have local law 11 for building facades. They just came out in the last year or so in specific requirement for inspecting parking garages. So I'm concentrating on New Jersey, but these type of regulations are happening or in place in a number of different places. Now let's look at Hackensack, New Jersey. Hackensack had a parking garage that collapsed, I think it was about 10 years ago. Hackensack has put into place an ordinance that requires the inspection of all parking garages every, I think it's 5 years. Yeah, here it is. Parking garages every 5 years, and it includes an evaluation report. Now, parking garages, as I mentioned before, are a high kind of risk structure because they're exposed to the elements, so they're touching the water, and at the same time, the water that's in there, especially in the winter, carries salt in it, which increases the rate of deterioration. So these are some of the things that are going on legislatively. Now let's talk about from a structural perspective. And now I'm talking about the legislation in New Jersey. Keep in mind the legislation in New Jersey as of right now is based on the primary load-bearing system. Based on what happened in Sea Isle City with the collapse of the balcony, there has been a recent, in the last couple of days, recommendation that the legislation be updated to say primary load-bearing system and balconies on the exterior buildings. So that's, my guess is that if this legislation goes ahead, it is going to include balconies, but maybe not facades. We'll see. It's like I said, it's a work in progress. But if you look at just the structure of the building in the legislation right now, these are the exact words. It says a covered building means a residential building that's categorized in use group or R1 or R2, which means it's multifamily residential attached units, having load-bearing concrete, masonry, steel, hybrid structure, including but not limited to heavy timber and a building with podium decks. Now, the key point to take out of this, which I consider to be the right way to do it, is that the structural inspections are based on the material of construction, not the height of the building. As you saw, I think it's in Jersey City, it's only concrete buildings about 6 stories high or above. But what happens if you have a steel building that's more than 6 stories high? I promise you, I've seen problems with steel buildings that are more than 6 stories high and less than 6 stories high. Or what happens if you have a concrete building that's only 4 stories high? I promise you, I've seen buildings that are concrete that are 4 stories high that have structural problems. So the key point to keep in mind here, that the need for the inspections and evaluation are based on the type of structure, the materials, not the height of the building, which is also what the public policy says. And there are some, the CAI National Public Policy, and there's also national standards out there put out by, I don't know if I include them in this presentation, but they're put out by the American Society of Civil Engineering on civil engineers. There's one standard that is said, the title is evaluating the structure of existing buildings, and it has guidelines for evaluating the structure, which all of these standards reference. And it talks about inspecting buildings and evaluating based on materials, not based on height. When it comes to facades, it is generally based on height. And there is an American Society of Civil Engineers also puts out another publication on evaluating building envelopes, which is the facade and the roof, and it talks about the height of the building. I'll also say, for example, that in most places it starts with a height of maybe 2 or 3 stories high, but on the Delaware task force I'm involved in, it's probably going to include facades on buildings anything above 2 stories high, because we want to make sure that we capture all balconies, not just the facade itself. So, from the legislative perspective in New Jersey in regard to structure, this is what is a covered building. So this other things in the current legislation, I'm not going into as much detail as yesterday, but I want to point out some things. It says that building safety starts when a building is being built, not 20 years after it was built. So what the legislation includes in it is that when a building is being built, if there's a change from what the design drawings show in regard to the structure, before a certificate of occupancy is issued for that building, there has to be an engineering report that says that the structural adequacy of the as-built building is equivalent to what the design drawings show. So that's before a certificate of occupancy is issued. Now, I think we all recognize that buildings are never built exactly the way the drawings show, but this clearly says that if it affects the structure, it has to be proven that it's still structurally as strong as it was before, with a letter from an engineer that says that. The structural inspector issues a written report, confirms that it's equivalent. So these are the exact words from the legislation. Then what about the inspections? Now, the legislation now says that for a building that is built after this legislation comes into effect, the first structural inspection takes place 15 years after the bill's passage. And I'll go back to that in a second why. It also says for buildings that were built prior to the passage of this legislation, when it goes in place, that For buildings that are 10 years or more since they were built, so they're at least 10 years old, the first inspection has to take place within 2 years. For buildings that were built within 5 to 10 years, it's 4 years. And at buildings that were built in the last 5 years, the first inspection has to take place within 6 years. Now, just so you know, the way the bill was originally written, it says that all buildings have to be inspected within 2 years prior to this legislation. But based on discussion, it was kind of agreed, and this is kind of a pending modification. It was agreed that there's so many buildings, how are you going to inspect them all within 2 years? So let's phase them in based on the age of the building, because as I said before, deterioration that causes structural problems is a progressive problem. So if the building's newer, there's less chance of having these type of things happen. The reason why the 15 years for buildings built after the passage of this legislation, which I'll get to in a little while, is that right now, if you build a new condo in community association in New Jersey, the developer is required to put together a reserve study in the governing documents. The legislation also requires that for all new buildings going forward, not only will it require a reserve study, but it's also going to require that a maintenance manual be included that outlines when the preventive maintenance should be done, what the preventive maintenance is, and what the cost of the preventive maintenance will be in the future, so that it was agreed that since there's going to be preventive maintenance put in place, that the first inspection doesn't need to take place until longer in period of time. But also the legislation requires that as part of that maintenance manual, it includes in there how often the building should have a structural inspection done. And so it's funded also, and it's in the legislation that needs to be budgeted for. So based on that, which I'll touch on again in a little while if I have enough time, that's why it was agreed that 15 years after the bill passage is good. Now, what does the first report say? When you do the first report, whether 2 years, 3 years, 15 years, whatever, it says the condition of the primary load-bearing system, any required maintenance or repair, and the description of what needs to be done. And it also says when the next inspection is required, but it's no longer than 10 years from the first inspection report, or 60 days if there's any observed damage. But clearly, if there's any damage or problems you see that need immediate attention, it has to be taken care of right away. So this is what the legislation says. And again, this legislation pretty much mimics what the national public policy says and what's being done in other states. So after the first inspection is done, what about inspections after that? For buildings that are up to 20 years old, inspection is a maximum of every 10 years. For buildings that are up to after 20 years old, every 5 years. But it says maximum. The reason it says maximum is because the prior report says it has to be done in 4 years. It has to be done in 4 years. You can't wait either the 10 years or the 5 years. So, but this is what it says in the legislation. That's the bold points on the left. And on the right is the actual words from the legislation. Who has to do it? It has to be done by a licensed engineer that's familiar in structural systems of existing buildings. That doesn't mean somebody else can't work with the engineer to do the inspections and do parts of it, but the final reports have to be signed and sealed by a licensed engineer. Now, that's across the board. That's not just in New Jersey. That's just about every standard I've seen when it comes to structural evaluations. It has to be done by a licensed professional engineer. So it does say a PE, and that's what it says on the right. All right, now let's switch topics for a second in terms of mortgage lending changes. And again, it's very interesting because I've gotten involved in some interesting stuff. As a matter of fact, when it comes to Fannie and Freddie, and they've come out with, you probably all know, they've come out with forms to do inspections, and you have to confirm the safety of the building in order to get mortgages and refinances and all kinds of stuff. So they came out with a form, which you're all familiar with. I'll show you what the form looks like. That's what their addendum form looks like for Fannie and Freddie. Now, these forms are based on the ability for associations to show that two things: that the buildings that you live in are safe, and that you're funding adequately for reserves for replacements. The reserve funding requirement was in there before. It's been there forever. What they generally say is that if in order to prove adequate reserves, you have to be setting aside 10% of your annual budget into reserves. And up until a few years ago, it also said, or fund in conformance with the reserve study that was done in the past couple of years. Now, as of right now, if I'm not mistaken, what it says is that Fannie says it's 10% of the annual budget. Freddie says it's 10% of the annual budget, but if you have a reserve study, you can go by what the reserve study says. But in either case, I think you'll all recognize the fact that that's missing two things. It's missing, first of all, has the association set aside any money before? So if you have no money in your reserve fund and your building is 30 years old, but you can show that you have 10% of your annual budget being set aside into reserves, that's adequate, even though you have zero money in your reserve fund. So there's a flaw there. The other thing is that the 10% is of your operating budget and it doesn't tie into the actual physical components of the building. It's just based on the operating budget. And I have an example that you got two communities, one's a high rise, one's a low rise, the budget's the same. 10% is the same number, but the amount of physical components make up the building are significantly different. So it really doesn't work. So I will tell you what's going on, that when they issued this form, they are in the process of reviewing changes to the reserve requirements and changing to the safety requirements they have in that form, because the form, if you looked at it, isn't 100% clear what they're looking for. And they recognize this. And I had the opportunity about 3 or 4 weeks ago to go to Washington because Fannie and Freddie met, and they invited people from across the country to come and give them feedback in a private meeting. You had to sign in a non-disclosure, so I'm telling you I was there, but I'm not going to tell you what we talked about. But to talk about what's going on and how do we make this work so that it's actually the reserve studies are tied into the buildings and the safety inspections and things like that are not only consistent between Fannie and Freddie, but also are more logically based. So I will tell you right now, I can show you all these slides about what they say now, about everything that's in the forms now, but that's in the process of being changed. It's going to come out. I'm hoping it's going to be better. Keep in mind, according to Fannie and Freddie, they own 62% or more, it's probably more, of the mortgages related to community associations for refinancing and buying new units. So I'm a firm believer that, forgetting about the legislation, that Fannie and Freddie need to come out with something good, because then people will be forced to do this kind of stuff to maintain the safety of their buildings. But at the same time, it won't be tied into legislators that I'll stop there. So I really think that they're going to come out with something good. It's going on right now. For example, right now they have terminology like significant deferred maintenance or unsafe conditions, but they have two different definitions of it. The policies do not apply to routine maintenance, repair, damage, or deferred maintenance. It's isolated to 1 or 2 units, all kinds of stuff that is in the current regulations. But I promise you, CAI is very proactively pushing them to make these things work better. And they are actively trying to do that also. As a matter of fact, I've connected with some of the people at Fannie and Freddie, and they're pretty nice. As a matter of fact, they sent me an email yesterday asking me some questions about stuff. So you're going to see some good stuff happening with the Fannie and Freddie regulations. As you know, it's a governmental organization, kind of. So who knows the timing of this, but they're definitely working on it. So we talked about what is a building designed for. It's designed for the wind, it's designed for earthquakes, it's designed for snow, it's designed for all kind of stuff. But one of the things it's not designed for is deterioration due to aging. So that's what all of this stuff is about. And what protects the building? It's the maintenance of the building envelope. I touched on that. Water is not good for deterioration. No matter what it is, it can be built perfectly and it's still going to cause buildings age, and water causes them to age faster. So a couple things. What is maintenance? Because maintenance is a key to everything I'm talking about. A lot of people look at maintenance as one term. It's the process of preserving something. But it's very important to recognize that maintenance, there's 3 different types of maintenance that you should be aware of when it comes to this. And this is going to be detailed in 10 pages rather than 2 minutes in the upcoming best practices paper the CAI is issuing regarding maintenance. But the type of maintenance that a lot of people do is what's called deferred maintenance. Deferred maintenance means you defer it and you don't do it. Deferred maintenance is not what you want to do because you're not doing anything. So there's 2 other kinds of maintenance that you should be doing. The first is preventive maintenance. Preventive maintenance, proactive plan to maintain something so it stays in good condition and attains its useful life. So for example, if you have something on your reserve study that's a 20-year life, preventive maintenance will make sure that you get at least that 20-year life out of it. But there are other things that are on your reserve that are not on your reserve study that are part of your building, such as the structure. So the structure should have some type of preventive maintenance done to it. Sometimes preventive maintenance is as simple as doing an inspection to make sure the condition is good, but preventive maintenance, proactive, something that you plan to do. Corrective maintenance is when you don't do maintenance and something happens to the building, you have to correct it. It's called corrective maintenance. So corrective maintenance is something that you can't plan for. It's following detection of a problem. And a lot of times it's because you use deferred maintenance, not preventive maintenance. There's going to be a quiz on this soon, by the way. So it's because you don't do something, but corrective maintenance is another type of maintenance. Now, everybody gets concerned about the biggest thing is, well, this is going to cost more. It's going to cost more. I shouldn't do this. No, if you take a look at the cost of preventive maintenance, there's many different standards and guides out there for this. And my basic guide is that the cost of preventive maintenance is about 5% of the cost of the replacement. So if you have a roof that or something has to be replaced that's $100,000 over 20 years, then take 5% of that, and that's the approximate cost of preventive maintenance to make sure that you maintain it and it stays in good condition, it attains its full useful life. So people are afraid. They say, well, it's going to cost 5% more. But if you have to do corrective maintenance because you don't do preventive maintenance, you can add up the cost of the preventive maintenance and multiply times 30, 40, 50, 60, and it's significantly more expensive to fix something than it is to maintain it. So it's very important when you talk to your boards and whoever you talk to about this, the first question is going to be, it costs me too much, I don't want to do it. And from a life cycle cost basis, doing preventive maintenance is much, much less expensive than doing corrective maintenance. So I like to include the side about life cycle cost of maintenance because everybody talks about that. All right, now let's talk about a little about the future of reserve studies and what's happening. First of all, history. The National Reserve Study Standards were issued in 2009. I can't believe it's only been 2009. It was updated in 2018. By the way, I served on the committees that did the original development of standards when we updated in 2018. The Reserve Study National Public Policies were issued in 2022. And right now, as I mentioned, we're finalizing the changes to the Reserve Study Standards to reflect what I talked about before. You see I put the parentheses around national because you saw it's being changed to international. What is a reserve study? Now, some of these things, like you see the letters in the back, that's a draft. I copied this directly out of the draft of the new international standards, so you can see some of the wording it's going to say. A reserve study is a budget planning tool which identifies the components that a community association is responsible to maintain or replace, the current status of the reserve fund, and a stable and equitable funding plan to offset the anticipated future major common area expenditures. That really hasn't changed. So what is a reserve study? Pretty much the same. What does a reserve study not include? This is very specifically included in there. This limited evaluation is conducted for budget and cash flow purposes. Tasks outside the scope of a reserve study include, but are not limited to, design review, construction evaluation, intrusive or destructive testing, preventive maintenance plans, and/or safety or structural evaluations. It's not included in the reserve study. So the question is, if we were trying to connect as part of these new standards, the reserve study to preventive maintenance as well as structural inspections, how did we do it? What it says in the standards now is that when we're doing a reserve study, whoever's doing it, we have to talk to our client to find out, do you have a preventive maintenance plan in place? If they don't, we need to highly recommend that they put one in place. And if they don't have one, we have to adjust the estimated remaining lives of the components on the schedule to reflect a lack of maintenance. Because right now, a lot of times the assumption is made that if a standard says a wood deck will last 20 years, just picking out an example, that we use 20 years in our reserve study. But the 20-year life on the wood deck may be based on doing something to it so it attains the 20 years. But if we go and do an inspection and see that there's no maintenance being done, we will reduce the estimated remaining life and the full useful life of those decks in the reserve study to reflect a lack of maintenance. So it specifically says that in terms of what the reserve provider should do in the standards. Keep in mind also that when every state I know of that's instituting new regulations in regards to reserve studies says that the reserve studies prepared should be based on the most current version of the reserve study standards put out by the Community Associations Institute. So they're all tying back into that as the standard, as is the legislation in the state of New Jersey. So that's how we address that. Keep in mind that some reserve providers like myself not only can do reserve studies, but we can put together a preventive maintenance plan for the community, but other reserve studies can't do it. So there was pushback from the group that we should actually do the preventive maintenance as part of the reserve study, but we need to reference to it and adjust the reserve study results to reflect it. As far as the structural and safety evaluations, the standard also says that if the building is meets one of the covered buildings that I talked about, for example, made out of concrete or whatever it is, the reserve study providers are not engineers. They're not some, well, 50% of them are not engineers, but the vast majority of them are not engineers, even that can do inspections. But if you see a condition, we say something in the reserve study as just something that they should look at, but we're not looking for it. But the reserve study should include in it the cost of doing the periodic structural inspections and the frequency that you should do them. So the reserve study is going to be a placeholder for the cost of doing the structural inspections by saying to the community, for example, we do a reserve study now, if it's the type of building I'm talking about, we include in the reserve study the cost, an estimated cost for the periodic inspections and the timing for it. The other thing it includes in the reserve studies now is the cost of the update. Most people don't have in their budget a line item that says update reserve study every 3 years or whatever. So now that's included in the reserve study. It should include the cost of the update. So those are the ways that the new standards are directly connecting into it, preventive maintenance and structural inspections. The other thing is that I think I have in a later slide, but I'll mention anyway, since I only have 12 minutes left, is that most things on a reserve study are based on a cyclical replacement time period. So every 10 years, you have to replace this thing. This is how much it is. That's changing also. So the corrective maintenance that I talked about as part of the structural inspection would be included in the reserve study. So when you're doing a reserve study, even though it only has to be done once to fix something, it's included in the reserve study. It's not cyclical. So keep that in mind, because one of the things that we need to ask for as part of the disclosures when we do reserve study is copies of any periodic structural inspections you've had done, so we can incorporate the results of those periodic structural inspections into the reserve study. So these are some of the things that are going to be in the new standards. This is directly from the new legislation in the state of New Jersey. Right now, the way it works in New Jersey is that when a developer builds a community association, the developer has to put together a reserve study in the governing document budget. Once the community takes over, there's no statutory requirements that the community has to do a reserve study. That's one of the reasons that we may run into problems, because people don't fund them after they take control because they want to keep the fees low. The new statute, the legislative requirements say that associations have to do reserve studies. They have to do them, and they have to fund them, and they have to be adequately funded. So I'm not going to go into the exact words, but that's what it says. It also said that they should be done in conformance with the reserve study standards of CAI, and it says it should be prepared by a reserve specialist or a licensed engineer or a licensed architect, but either way, it has to be done in conformance with the CAI standards. So it's going to be a requirement. Now the question, and it should be, if they don't have a reserve study that's within the last 5 years, it has to be done within the next 2 years. Now the question comes up, what happens if that reserve study, when it's done, shows that it's not adequately funded? Now let me define for you quickly what adequate funding means based on the national definition. Adequate funding means that you're not going to have enough money in the reserve study to replace something, and you're going to have to get money from somewhere else, whether it's a special assessment or it's borrowing. There's not enough money in the reserve fund. So that's what the definition of adequate is. Now I'll touch on it later because I still think that may be too low, but that's what the definition is in the legislation as well as in the national standards. So what does it say? If you do a reserve study and it shows that you're not adequately funded, here's what the legislation says. And there's been a bunch of discussion about this, I promise. I don't know exactly how it's going to turn out. But as of now, what it conceptually says is that if you have to increase your reserve funding and it increases your annual budget by more than 10%, you have to bring it to within adequate funding within 10 years of the date of the study, number one, or before the time that you have to replace something that'll put you in a deficit. So it's 10 years to bring it to adequacy, But let's say you have to replace something in 3 years, and in 3 years, it's going to show you that you're in a deficit. It shows that you have to bring it to adequate funding within those 3 years so you have enough money. Now, you may, I hate to say, but you may bring it to adequate funding by doing a special assessment or doing borrowing, but you have to bring it to adequacy before you do that because you're going to need the money anyway. So now if it comes out that you do the reserve study and it says that you don't have to increase your annual budget by 10%, it's less than 10%, then it says that you have to increase your reserve funding so you bring it to adequacy within 2 years. Now that's what the legislation says right now. So there's a concern with people that there's going to be jump in maintenance fees because of this, and there's a lot of concern, as you would expect from legislators that our constituents are going to say we're increasing this, we're increasing that. But the argument that we make, which is the real argument, is that from a life cycle cost basis, if communities would have funded the reserve study and updated it the way it's said in their governing documents, they would not be behind the 8 ball. And the problem is that when you have to replace a roof or something, if the roof or the boiler or whatever is not going to wait until you have the money, it's going to have to be replaced. So from a life cycle cost basis, you need the money and you need to put this in place. So that's what the legislation says right now. That's what those slides say. Now, what are the changes? I'm going to go through quickly. What are some of the changes that are the new standards show? Now, this is the same slide. The reserve study includes 2 parts: the physical analysis and the financial analysis, made up the component inventory and all these kind of things. Now, here's some of the changes. You've probably all heard of what's called the 30-year rule. The 30-year rule with reserve studies essentially says that you should include the components on your reserve study that will require replacement within 30 years of when the study is done. So, and then when you update the study, although the current standards don't say it, when you update the study, you should do a projection out 30 years. And you add things to the reserve study that now fall within that 30-year window. One of the things I've seen happen a lot is that communities update a prior reserve study, but they don't add components to it. They don't look into the future. So the component inventory is now the 30-year rule is gone essentially. Any component that has a useful life that you can measure, whether it's 40 years, 50 years, whatever it is, should be included on the reserve study. We do not have the limit of 30 years anymore. It's gone. So, but the association can make a couple of decisions. Now I'm going to show you what the decision is, but this is highlighted in yellow because I copied it directly out of the draft of the new standards. You can see in the background. Let's see. So it's still, the wording may not be 100% yet. But now this is what the physical analysis looks like. You all know what this looks like. It's component list, useful lives, all that kind of stuff. This is the cash flow. But updating, how often should you update it? What you should do when you update it. Now, I'm going to show you why this affects the components because it used to be that you would be updating a prior study, but the best practices say, and the legislation in New Jersey says, and the public policy says, it should be updated a maximum every 5 years. But the best practice is to update it every 3 years. So that's what the updating is from a public policy perspective. But now let's talk about, I described for you what the definition of adequate reserve is, because that question comes up a lot. But now let's talk about, here's a few different levels of service for a reserve study. You have a full study where you do everything. Now keep in mind, when you do a full study, now the component list is going to include components that have more than a 30-year life. But the wording is just, what it's going to say is, even if you don't fund the components that have a life more than 30 years, the other option is to include them in the study, but show in the study that they're there with the useful life so the association knows that they need to add them in the future. In most cases, the requirement is going to be, or it's going to, that you add them in the beginning and you amortize the life over the full life. Now you have that's the full study, you do everything. Update without a site visit. You don't go to the site, you just update it based on what's on the list. A preliminary study is done by the developer as part of the governing documents and it's not built yet. Now, the reason I put an X through the update with the site visit is because this is changing. It says that one of the things you don't do is a component inventory. But here's what the level 2 update with the site visit is going to require be done from now on. It says that it says that the component inventory, it does not require that the person go out and reestablish all the quantities and everything that's on there. But it says that if a component is now falls within in the future, forgetting about the 30 years, but it falls in the future, even outside that 30 years, that was not in the original study, as part of that update, it needs to be added. It's not optional anymore. It has to be added. So one of the concerns is that when we start adding all these components like vinyl siding or bulkheads from docks and all those kind of things, we start adding into the study, it's going to make for a significant bump in the amount of reserve funding that you have to do. So it can be phased in, but they need to be listed on the study, and there needs to be essentially a plan in place of starting to add these things, definitely by the time they fall into that 30-year window, but they have to be listed in the study now as part of an update. It's not an optional thing. So let's see. Components are to be added, which were not previously included within the study being updated, which are now anticipated to occur within 30 years. There's additional explanatory wording that says, or further than that, but they don't necessarily have to be funded instantly. So this is a big change that's happening with the updates. Now let's talk about the financial analysis, the funding plans. I'll go through it pretty quickly. You've got baseline funding, threshold funding, full funding. I think most of the people on this webinar understand the difference. And I'll show you a graph, but baseline funding means it brings down to zero. You'll see I put in here the quote, is this adequate? I make the argument that adequate funding as defined by, which is defined essentially as baseline funding, is still the most risky, because if something has to be replaced a year earlier or cost $10 more than you thought, you can run into a deficit. By the way, the other thing I didn't put into the presentation, which I just thought of, is reserve studies are based on what you can see, not what you can't see. So when you may have common elements behind walls, like plumbing and things like that, they're not included in a reserve study because you can't see them. The new standard says that if you know that there are common elements that you cannot see, but you know they're there, you need to budget for them somehow in the reserve study. That's a big, I can't believe I left it out, but that's another big key point, because mainly now things are in the reserve study, things you can see. Most important, I would say, in high-rise building, because there's so much stuff behind the walls, riser pipes, all kinds of stuff. But if you can't see it, but you know it's there, somehow they have to be budgeted for in the reserve study. Very important. Now I'm just going to show you the cash flow is single component, multiple components, you add them up, and this is what it looks like. The bottom one is the green line. It's called baseline funding. That's the definition of adequate. But keep in mind, adequate right now, don't believe it, because right now this adequacy number in the reserve study, again, is based on things you can see, not things you can't see. And by raising that line to threshold funding or full funding or something else, gives you a cushion or a reserve in your reserve in case something happens to something you can't see. So while the adequacy definition is baseline funding, be very careful. And here, from a theoretical standpoint, adequacy refers to a funding plan, and but just what I said a second ago. Adequacy decision evaluates the risk tolerance. You need to go through a process, and I'm rushing through this now because I started at 9:31, so I have one more minute. But this just helps you evaluate what you can use for your threshold by looking at your risk tolerance, how often you update the reserve study, what's the cost of the most expensive thing on your reserve study that needs to be replaced, what are the things behind the walls that maybe need to be replaced that are not on the reserve study. So each community, based on their risk tolerance and what type of building they are and how old the community is, should come up with what makes their reserve fund adequate, which is based on how low you let the fund go over the 30-year projection period. By the way, the national standards used to say that you can have a funding projection of 20 to 30 years. It's been changed to only 30 years. You can't go as low as 20 years with your funding. When you evaluate the reserves, you retain a qualified expert, get a draft report, meet and go over it, and then finalize the report. Now, I show this slide. I like this slide, even though I'm a minute over, because this shows clearly the connection between reserves, maintenance, and the structure. This is a building that has a parking garage. You may call it a podium deck, whatever. Oh, look, the red boxes around the whole thing on the left. But so you have a podium deck. The podium deck has a structure underneath it. The podium deck is made up of certain things like a membrane and different things that go on the reserve study. So let's say you have a 20-year life on the podium deck. The podium deck also needs ongoing maintenance. If you don't maintain it, water is going to go through it. And if you don't maintain it, you'll have to replace it in 10 years instead of 20 years. If the water goes through a podium deck, say at an expansion joint or something like that, what's it going to do? It's going to deteriorate the structure underneath it that's protected by the podium deck. So by looking at this diagram, you see the connection between the podium deck and decking are included in the reserve study. The podium membrane and decking should be included in preventive maintenance program. And if you don't do this, the structure will deteriorate. You'll have very expensive corrective maintenance. And on top of that, the useful life of the podium deck will be significantly less. So you can see from a life cycle cost basis and an everyday cost basis, the connection between all three and the importance of them. What is the public policy required in terms of updates and things? I mentioned this already. What do you do as a manager or a board member as you're walking through communities? I just have a couple slides left. If you see conditions like this, you don't have to be an engineer to identify that if something's rusting and you see rusting like this, that means there's steel behind it. It's affecting the structure. You do something. If you just see this white material, it's called efflorescence. That means water is coming through, but you don't have the rust yet. So if you see something like this, if you act on it now and stop the water, it'll reduce the cost of corrective maintenance. It'll save you a significant amount of money. Don't cover up things so water doesn't go onto the cars by putting tarps in, because I promise you, when we took this blue tarp away, the structure was pretty much shot. If you see rust, figure out what's happening, because it could affect the structural integrity of the building. And what do? What's the plan? Implement a proactive preventive maintenance program along with the reserve study. And if your type of building is made up of a certain type of structure, requires periodic structural inspections, put them in the budget and do them. You may be forced to do them pretty soon. Update the reserve study on a regular basis. And that's pretty much, here are some of the standards. The reserve study standards, a book on reserve studies, a number of things. There's a best practices paper on reserve. There's a publication that CAI put on called Breaking Point, and it talks about infrastructures and buildings and how you need to watch them, or it's going to cost you a lot more money. So I said a lot of stuff in the last 62 minutes. If anybody would ever like a copy of this presentation given to your company or given to a board or given to a group of people, all you'd have to do is let us know. We'd be happy to do that. If you'd like a copy of this presentation or any of the things I referred to in the presentation, just email me and we'd be happy to send it to you. If anybody here, this class is approved for continuing education for managers as well as attorneys. So if anybody would like a certificate of continuing education units, just send to either me or Chelsea from my office, who's on here somewhere.
Here, there's actually a question too, Mitch, if you would like to answer.
No, it depends what the question is.
All right. Touche, Carl. We'll see if he wants to answer your question. Carl says that they've had a reserve study and update with a site visit by one company, and it's time to get a new study. Is it best practice to have a new company do a full study at this point, or rather than use the previous company?
Well, if the company that did originally was not Kipcon, it's best to switch, of course. But if the company did it in conformance with the national standards, and a lot of times it's done by another company. Let's put it that way. There's no reason why you have to stick with the original company, and unless the original one was done by Kipcon, of course. But there's no reason why you can't switch companies to update your study. The one thing I would make a suggestion to add, in this industry, people have a tendency to select the company that's going to update the reserve study or do the reserve study based on who's the least expensive. You got to take a look at the experience of people that are doing it, because keep in mind, you may spend $3,000 or $4,000 for a reserve study update, but it could impact 40% of your association's budget. So if you're saving $10 on the reserve study, it may not save you in coming up with a good plan and making sure it's something that works for you. So look, the pricing is so pretty close. I would look just as much, if not more, experience of the person or the company that's doing it than the price of the study. And that's not meant as a sales thing, although we do have experience doing it, but a lot of people make decisions on these things based on dollars, not based on experience. Absolutely. Anything else, Chelsea? Anybody
yes,
else?
There's actually one more question. How does one assess and evaluate roof risks?
Roof what?
Roof risks. Risks.
Rick?
It's a weird word to say, guys. Risk, R-I-S-K.
Oh, risk. How do you evaluate risk? I'm sorry. I thought you said roof. You evaluate risk because you can have two communities right next door to each other and the exact same community, the exact same age, the exact same everything, and they'll evaluate risk differently based on the board and come up with a different threshold for the reserve study. It really involves a discussion between the reserve provider and the board. Don't ever just take a reserve study and say, I'm going to use it or I'm not going to use it. You really have to meet with the company that did it and have a discussion of risk. I mean, for example, if you have something that needs to be replaced in 3 years and your community is 2 years old and you want to go, or 20 years old, and you want to go with a baseline study, and the recommendation may be to keep a threshold higher, or, but it's different. And a lot of it's based on the board and their risk tolerance and the age of building. So to evaluate risk by having a discussion with the person, the firm who prepared your study, that's the main way.
Right.
Anybody else? All right,
If anybody has any questions, obviously feel free to email Mitch or myself after that anything that comes up.
And thank you everybody for attending. We had, like I said, about 140, 150 people who signed up. So I guess the 50% show up rate is slightly above 50.
A little over. We hit 80 at one point, so it was pretty good. Thank you everybody for coming.
Well, thank you everybody. And like I said, if you need continuing education units, please feel free to get in touch with us. And if you have any ideas of future seminars or anything, please let us know, because as you can tell, I like to do this. So everybody have a great day, and thank you very much for coming, and feel free to email us with any questions or comments or whatever you have. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.